Hi, this is Steve Ritchie. This video is part 1 of my 11-part response to Christian Answers TV's video series on pre-Nicene Christian history, in which Trinitarian apologist Steve Morrison made erroneous and self-contradictory statements in his lectures on early Christian history. You may click on the links in the description below to watch all 11 videos detailing my response to Dr. Morrison's online lectures. Mr. Steve Morrison greatly errs when he alleges that the majority of the earliest Christians were true Trinitarians. The historical evidence reveals that there were no true Trinitarians living within the first 250 years of Christian history. And those who claimed to believe in the Trinity were really what Trinitarian historians themselves call semi-Arians rather than true Trinitarians. While the semi-Arians often use the words Trinity and persons, they believed a lot like modern-day Jehovah's Witnesses in affirming that the Son was literally created at the dawn of creation, rather than eternally existing as an alleged timeless God the Son. The semi-Arians further denied that the Son is the same substance as the Father. Moreover, the true historical data proves that the Oneness Christians were once the only Christians who believed in the full deity of Jesus Christ, and that the Oneness believing Christians comprised the numerical Christian majority within the first 300 years of Christian history. The historical evidence further proves that the semi-Arians denied that Jesus is the Most High God, and that they were in the minority until the early 4th century. What is Arianism? Arianism comes from the name Arius. Arius was an early 4th century Christian teacher who believed that Jesus was created, much like the Jehovah's Witnesses believe today. Jesus was not the true God, he was a lesser God, rather than the true God. So the semi-Arians believed a lot like Arius long before Arius even existed in the 4th century. So the semi-Arians believed a lot like Arius in the 2nd and 3rd centuries before Arius came on the scene in the 4th century. Under Arianism, the New Advent Encyclopedia explains the theology of the semi-Arians. While they affirm that the Word of God is everlasting, they imagine him as having become the Son to create the worlds and redeem mankind. 5 ante-Nicene fathers are especially quoted: Athenagoras, Tatian, Theophilus of Antioch, Hippolytus, and Novatian, whose language appears to involve a peculiar notion of sonship, as though it did not come into being or were not perfected until the dawn of creation. To these may be added Tertullian and Methodius. Cardinal Newman held that their view, which is found clearly in Tertullian, of the Son existing after the Word, is connected as the antecedent with Arianism. Wiki Encyclopedia explains the theology of the semi-Arians. The semi-Arians, however, admitted that the Son was of a similar substance as the Father, but not of the same substance as him. Therefore, the semi-Arians denied the true deity of Jesus Christ. The earliest Christians did not believe the same as modern-day evangelicals. At 3:30 into the Christian Answers TV video entitled Early Christian History Part 1, Mr. Morrison alleged that the Trinity doctrine was taught long before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Mr. Morrison further alleged that the early pre-Nicene Christians believed the same truth of the gospel as modern evangelical Christians do today. However, the historical evidence reveals that the earliest Christians did not believe in a trinity of 3 co-equal and co-eternal divine persons. They never taught that water baptism is not necessary for salvation. And according to Irenaeus and the 2nd century bishops of Rome, the majority of the earliest Christians believed in speaking in tongues and in the gifts of the Spirit, just like modern-day Oneness Pentecostals do today. Out of the 4,100 pages preserved from the pre-Nicene writings, No Trinitarian can cite a single Christian writer who taught a timeless God the Son before the time of Origen in the 3rd century. Like modern Jehovah's Witnesses, all of the so-called Trinitarians before the mid-3rd century taught that the Son of God was created before the world was made. In contradistinction, the only Christians who believed in the divinity of Jesus Christ within the first few hundred years of the Christian era were oneness believers. Moreover, no evangelical apologist can submit a single pre-Nicene writer who believed that water baptism was not necessary for salvation. Every single early Christian writer, both before and immediately after Nicaea, who addressed water baptism in detail, always addressed it as being either for the remission of sins or as part of the new birth of water according to John 3:5. Therefore, the historical evidence of the early pre-Nicene Christian era confirms that the earliest Christians were far closer to the beliefs of 21st century oneness Pentecostals rather than the beliefs of modern-day Protestant evangelicals. Mr. Morrison's idea that 4 or more early Christian writers doctrinally agreeing about something proves that there was a general consensus among the majority of Christians is patently false. At 5:15 into Dr. Morrison's Part 1 lecture on church history, Mr. Morrison said, "What if 10 or more writers all said the same thing and none denied it? Are you right to ignore that as the consensus of what they believed even if you don't agree with it?" Then at 5:30 into the Part 1 video, Mr. Morrison said that it is a generally agreed upon doctrine if 4 or more writers agreed to it and none denied it. What Mr. Morrison fails to consider is that the Roman Catholic Church subsequently destroyed almost all the writings of their oneness modalistic opponents. That is why we have virtually no writings of the modalists from the 3rd and 4th centuries and very few from the second half of the 2nd century. Under Sibelius, the New Advent Encyclopedia admits, all of his original works were burned. Author Paul Paval wrote, "No writings of Praxeas or Sibelius survive today because they were considered heresy by the Church." Church historian B.B. Edwards wrote that he, addressing Sibelius, was a writer, cannot well be questioned. The younger Arnobius says that in the 5th century some of his writings were still extant. Of what nature these were, he has not told us. End quote. It is easy to see how modern readers can peruse through the extant writings of the earliest Christians and falsely come up with the idea that the modalistic monarchian view was in the minority because almost all of their writings were later destroyed or burned. What if David Bernard, who is likely the most prominent oneness leader today, lived in the early 3rd century and all of his writings, including the writings of the oneness modalists living in the late 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, were destroyed? Since there was no printing press, recorded radio, or internet in the early days of Christianity, centuries later most people would remember only the most well-known oneness leaders, but only from the perspective of the extant writings of their opponents. Without the modern-day printing press, computers, and the internet, how much would people know about oneness Pentecostal leaders and their writings if they were all subsequently destroyed by the later Roman Catholic Church? Thus, it is historically accurate to affirm that we would know nothing about the less prominent oneness leaders whose writings were destroyed, and we would only know a few things about the most prominent oneness leaders from the surviving writings of their opponents. The only reason why we know so much about the semi-Arians like Hippolytus, Tertullian, Justin, Theophilus, Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria, etc., is due to the fact that we have some of their extant writings from Roman Catholic scribes who chose to save their writings over other writings that they neglected as more heretical. Hence, we would know very little, if anything, about the semi-Arians if the Roman Catholic Church had decided to destroy their writings. Thus, the only things we would know centuries later would likely be about the most prominent leaders of the movement, but only from the writings of their detractors, who might have easily misrepresented their views. This is precisely what happened in early Christian history. For how else can we explain why Tertullian identified the modalists in the West as, and I quote from Tertullian, they that always make up the majority of believers, and why Origen identified the modalists as the general run of Christians in the East? Wherefore, Trinitarian apologists who cite surviving early Christian writings from the Roman Catholic points of view are depending only on the number of extant surviving early Christian writers without taking into consideration the enormous emotional bias that the later state church used in determining what they perceived as heretical or orthodox. Thus, Trinitarian apologists who merely cite from the extant early Christian writings have a faulty method of finding what the majority of the earliest Christians actually believed in the early days of Christianity. The only way to gather the real historical narrative of early Christian history is by digging deeper into the earliest Christian writings, along with reading what the most honest church historians have uncovered from their extensive research. In the next video, I will be covering Oneness Modalism as being the most popular belief in ancient Christian theology in my response to Dr. Morrison Part 2. You may click on the links below. For further information, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit us on the web at apostolic-christian-faith.com. God bless.
Permission for this video was given to me by Global Impact Ministries. We are working together to bring the true gospel message to all the world, and thereby fulfilling the Great Commission given to us all by Jesus. I would suggest that you would subscribe to that channel, and this one also. Thank you for watching. God bless you.
Yalla bir ardına.